January 5th, 1943. The waters south of Guadalcanal shimmered under the morning sun as the USS Helena cut through the Pacific. The smell of cordite still lingered from the previous night's bombardment of Japanese positions at Munda Airfield. The crew was tense. Retaliation always came quickly. Radar operators leaned over glowing screens, scanning for the faintest trace of movement. Then they saw them 4 Japanese dive bombers. Val types, dark specks against the rising sun. The alarm howled across the deck. Men sprinted to their battle stations. The Helena's guns swung upward, steel giants awakening for the day's first kill. The Japanese formation broke apart, dropping into their attack runs. Bombs fell, slamming into the cruiser, Achilles nearby. Plumes of water and smoke erupted. The attackers banked hard, pulling up to retreat. They believed they were out of range. They weren't. Commander William S. Parsons gave the order. The Helena's 5-inch guns fired not a barrage, just a few precise shells. The crew watched through binoculars as the shells streaked skyward and then exploded in midair. No direct hits. Yet, one valve burst into flames and spiraled down. Another disintegrated seconds later. The deck fell silent. It was impossible, at least. It should have been. For decades, naval gunnery depended on mathematics, timing, and luck. To hit a fast-moving aircraft miles away was nearly hopeless. But these shells didn't need to hit. They knew when to explode. Inside their steel casings hid a secret so tightly guarded it ranked just below the atomic bomb. The weapon had no name sailors could speak aloud. Only a coded term, variable time fuse. Few on board understood what it truly was. But that morning, in the skies over the Solomon Sea, it proved itself beyond doubt. Those shells had sensed the enemy. They had detonated at the perfect instant, shredding aircraft that thought they were safe. The men of the Helena had just witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare, one where electronics, not guesswork, decided life and death. That day's engagement would ripple through every battlefield to come. It was the moment when machines began to think just enough to kill. Long before the Helena's gunners pulled their triggers that morning, the idea of a shell that could think for itself had been dismissed as fantasy. Anti-aircraft warfare in the early years of World War II was an act of desperation, not precision. The statistics told a brutal truth. It took more than 20,000 rounds to bring down a single aircraft. For sailors on the gun decks of destroyers and cruisers, that meant pouring tons of ammunition into the sky and praying one shell might intersect an invisible speck moving hundreds of miles per hour. 2 kinds of fuses ruled the battlefield, both tragically limited. Contact fuses only detonated when a shell physically struck its target, something nearly impossible against a maneuvering aircraft. Time fuses were slightly better, set to explode at a predicted moment after firing. But they required a perfect calculation of altitude, speed, wind, and angle variables that changed every second. A fraction of error. And the explosion would bloom harmlessly in the empty sky. Gun crews worked like mathematicians under fire, twisting dials and shouting coordinates, while enemy planes streaked overhead untouched. The cost of this inefficiency was measured not in numbers, but in lives. At Pearl Harbor, at the Coral Sea, and again at Midway, Japanese dive bombers carved American ships to pieces. Their accuracy was deadly, their courage unquestioned. Meanwhile, Allied gunners fired until barrels glowed red, often hitting nothing but clouds. Aerial warfare had turned the vast Pacific into a graveyard of burning ships, and the Allies needed a miracle. That miracle began not on the deck of a warship, but in a quiet laboratory. Across the Atlantic, British scientists had already begun experimenting with the concept of a proximity fuse, a device that could sense when it was close enough to a target to detonate automatically. The idea sounded simple. Let the shell do the aiming. But the execution demanded something close to magic. In 1940, as bombs rained over London, the British sent one of their greatest scientists, Sir Henry Tizard, on a secret mission to the United States. Inside his black metal dispatch case were some of Britain's most precious secrets: jet propulsion data, radar research, and early notes on proximity detection. The British lacked the industrial capacity to pursue the idea. But in America, vast factories and fresh minds waited. The task fell to a physicist named Dr. Merle Tuve at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory. Tuve was not a soldier but a man of science who had studied the upper atmosphere using radio waves. He understood how to make electronics sense in visible distances, knowledge that suddenly became a matter of life and death. Tuve's team, codenamed Section T, worked under conditions of secrecy rivaling even the Manhattan Project. Their mission: fit a radar system into the nose of an artillery shell, small enough to survive the unimaginable forces of gunfire, and smart enough to detonate within yards of its target. Each shell was only 5 inches in diameter, yet inside it would need a miniature transmitter, receiver, amplifier, antenna, and battery. All of it had to function after being fired at 2,500 feet per second, while enduring 20,000 times the force of gravity. The first tests were disasters. Standard vacuum tubes shattered into dust. Engineers retrieved only twisted metal and glass powder from the test range. Even tubes designed for oil drilling collapsed instantly. The acceleration was so violent that glass behaved like liquid, flowing and warping before disintegrating. Engineers joked grimly that their fuses had become radio confetti, but Tuve refused to give up. With the help of industrial partners like Sylvania Electric, his team redesigned every component from scratch. They shortened wire leads to just a few millimeters, reinforced glass with new alloys, and filled the tubes with carefully balanced gas mixtures to prevent short circuits. Still, most prototypes failed. In one brutal stretch of testing, 900 consecutive fuses were destroyed without a single success. Then, in late 1941, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young physicist named James Van Allen, who would later discover the Earth's radiation belts, proposed an unconventional idea: suspend the vacuum tubes in a soft medium that could absorb shock. After countless trials, he found the answer: a precise mixture of wax and transformer oil. The substance cushioned the tubes during launch, spreading the impact forces evenly. When the shells fired, most still shattered, but enough survived to prove the concept worked. Another impossible problem remained: power. The fuse needed electricity, but no battery on Earth could activate instantly under such conditions. The solution bordered on genius. Engineers built a tiny glass capsule filled with electrolyte fluid. When the gun fired, the sudden acceleration shattered the glass, releasing the liquid to complete the circuit and activate the battery. The same force that once destroyed the fuse now powered it. Piece by piece, the impossible became real. By 1942, the first functioning prototypes were ready. Each one was a marvel, an entire radar system, no larger than an ice cream cone, capable of detecting an aircraft and detonating itself at exactly the right distance. The Navy called it simply the VT fuse, short for variable time. You see, secrecy surrounded the weapon like armor. Workers in factories had no idea what they were building. Engineers were forbidden to discuss their work, even with colleagues in the next building. Each component carried a false name to obscure its purpose. The fuse itself was treated as if it were alive, handled with gloves, shipped in sealed crates, and guarded by Marines. The first live test took place in August 1942 aboard the newly commissioned light cruiser USS Cleveland in Chesapeake Bay. The Navy used remote-controlled drone aircraft as targets, fast, small, and evasive. On the first day, the Cleveland's gunners fired 4 rounds. 3 drones were destroyed. The results stunned everyone present. The second day of testing was canceled. There was no need. The weapon worked. Production began immediately. By late 1942, thousands of fuses were being manufactured in secret facilities across the country. Yet, even as reports of their success reached Washington, the Pentagon imposed severe restrictions. The new shells could be used only over deep ocean water, where any dud would sink beyond recovery. On land, the risk of a fuse being captured and reverse-engineered was too great. The technology was deemed second in importance, only to the atomic bomb. And so, while sailors in the Pacific began to see their survival rates soar, soldiers in Europe fought and died with the same outdated munitions. The proximity fuse remained locked away from the ground war, guarded not by steel doors but by fear, the fear that one lost shell could hand its secret to the enemy. In the Pacific, however, the results were undeniable. The USS Helena's engagement off Guadalcanal proved what scientists had dreamed of for years. The new shells didn't rely on luck or mathematics. They simply sensed their prey and detonated with ruthless precision. By 1943, ships equipped with VT ammunition required barely a third of the rounds once needed to destroy enemy aircraft. At night, when traditional fuses were blind, proximity fuses turned darkness into an ally. What had begun as a desperate scientific gamble was now rewriting the rules of naval warfare. The sky itself had become lethal. Japanese pilots, who once trusted altitude and darkness to shield them, now faced invisible death shells that thought, sensed, and struck without warning. For the men who fired them, there was awe, pride, and something else, a quiet unease. They knew these weapons were more than tools. They were a new kind of intelligence, a prelude to the age of automated killing. The proximity fuse was more than just a technological leap. It was the first whisper of modern warfare's cold precision. And while the Navy embraced its power, the Army waited watching from Europe's frozen fields, unaware that one day their survival would depend on this same forbidden invention. By 1943, the proximity fuse had already begun changing the rhythm of war across the Pacific. On ships like the USS Helena, Cleveland, and Atlanta, the results were undeniable. Every engagement seemed to confirm what radar men whispered between shifts, that the VT shells were rewriting the very physics of naval defense. Sailors no longer fired endless streams of ammunition into the sky, hoping for a lucky hit. Instead, a handful of rounds could carve burning trails through Japanese squadrons. The statistics spoke louder than rumor. Traditional time-fused shells required roughly 500 rounds to bring down a single enemy aircraft. Proximity-fused ammunition needed only 150. At night, the advantage became even greater. Where darkness once shielded bombers, now it trapped them. Radar-directed fire guided VT shells into unseen skies, and invisible bursts of steel found their marks with terrifying consistency. Yet, the most astonishing part was how few people truly understood why it worked. Even many officers knew little more than the vague term, variable time. The science behind the weapon was treated as forbidden knowledge. If a shell failed to detonate, its wreckage was to be destroyed at all costs. Ships received strict orders never to use VT rounds over land or shallow water. Any dud, if captured, could expose secrets more valuable than gold. For now, secrecy ruled. The Navy could enjoy the advantage the Army could not. In Europe, generals were already pleading for the weapon that sailors swore by. Reports filtered from the Pacific of kamikazes dropping from the sky, of entire squadrons shattered before they could release their bombs. To men fighting in Italy, France, and the Ardennes, those stories felt like something from another world. In Washington, the Pentagon's reasoning was cold but calculated. If the Germans ever recovered an intact fuse, they could reverse engineer it within months. Their scientists were among the best in the world. Men like von Braun and Telefunken's engineers already worked at the edge of radio technology. If proximity fuses began to appear in German flak guns, Allied bombers over Berlin would stand no chance. The skies of Europe would become a slaughterhouse. So, the weapon stayed locked away, waiting for the day when the risk of loss outweighed the risk of defeat. That day came in December 1944. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the German army launched its last great offensive. It began before dawn, under a blizzard sky. 250,000 German troops surged forward, supported by 500 tanks and 2,000 artillery pieces. The Americans, spread thin and resting after months of combat, were caught in chaos. This was the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final gamble to split the Allied front and force a negotiated peace. Artillery thunder rolled across the snow. Entire villages vanished under fire. American gunners, using standard shells, fought desperately to slow the advance. But snow-absorbed shock. Shells buried themselves deep before exploding. German infantry emerged from the white haze almost untouched. Forward observers tried to correct aim, but in the fog and confusion, nothing worked. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces, watched the situation deteriorate hour by hour. He had seen the proximity fuse's performance in Navy reports, knew it was 3 times as effective, maybe more. He also knew his soldiers were dying by the thousands, while that weapon sat unused in depots. On December 21st, with American lines collapsing and weather grounding all air support, Eisenhower made his decision. He sent an urgent message to the Pentagon. Release the fuse. Use it everywhere. Within hours, 200,000 VT fuse shells were loaded onto trucks and rushed toward the front. Their code name was changed to Posit, a final layer of deception. Most soldiers had no idea what made them different, only that they were the new ones that really work. The first test came almost immediately. At the town of Echternach, in Luxembourg, General George S. Patton's Third Army received orders to halt a German counterattack. His artillery units had just been resupplied with the new ammunition. As dawn broke on December 23rd, the Germans began crossing the Sauer River. Hundreds of men moved in the open snow, confident that fog and cloud cover made them invisible to Allied spotters. They were wrong. Patton's artillery opened fire. The shells arced high, vanishing into mist, and then erupted above the Germans' heads, mid-air, shredding entire formations. It wasn't ground impact. It was death from above. Witnesses later said it looked like lightning striking the same place again and again. When the smoke cleared, the count was horrifying. 702 German soldiers lay dead. The survivors ran without order, many abandoning weapons as they fled. In his diary that night, Patton wrote, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. When all armies get this shell, we will have to devise a new method of warfare." That prediction wasn't exaggeration, it was prophecy. Across the front, wherever proximity-fused shells arrived, the tide turned. German infantry, who once trusted trenches and foxholes, now found themselves defenseless. Traditional artillery exploded on impact, sending fragments sideways. VT shells detonated in the air, raining steel vertically down into positions once thought safe. Prisoners later described the terror. "There was no warning," one soldier from the 12th SS Panzer Division said. "The shells exploded above us. The air itself was killing us." Entire units vanished without a trace. In one engagement, an American division fired a coordinated time-on-target barrage. With proximity shells, 96 Germans died instantly. There were no survivors. By Christmas Day, 1944, the German advance had stopped cold. What began as a confident push toward Antwerp ended as a massacre in the snow. The fuse that had once been forbidden became the weapon that saved the Allied cause. As the war turned back in the Allies' favor, its impact spread far beyond the forests of Belgium. Over the skies of Antwerp, anti-aircraft gunners began using the same technology to intercept Germany's V-1 flying bombs. Before the proximity fuse, barely 1 in 5 could be shot down. Afterward, the success rate soared to 80%. London and Antwerp survived because of a weapon once locked away by caution. And, in the Pacific, thousands of miles away, another kind of war was about to test it again. A war where the enemy no longer cared about surviving. When Japan unleashed its kamikaze attacks, proximity fuses would face their greatest trial yet. But first, the world had to learn that a single fuse, no larger than an ice cream cone, could alter the course of human history. By the end of 1944, the tide of war had begun to shift. In Europe, the Battle of the Bulge had ended in disaster for Germany. In the Pacific, the U.S. Navy was pushing relentlessly toward Japan's home islands. But as victory seemed near, a new terror emerged, one that no American had ever faced before. They called it kamikaze divine wind. It was the most desperate weapon Japan had ever conceived. Fighter planes, stripped of armor and overloaded with explosives, were flown directly into American ships. The pilots, often barely out of school, wore white headbands and carried farewell letters. They took off, knowing they would never return. To face an enemy who wanted to die was something new, something almost impossible to counter. Gunfire, flak, and interception could not deter men who no longer cared about surviving. Even when their planes were torn apart, the wreckage often slammed into ships with devastating effect. In one attack during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a single kamikaze pilot crashed into the carrier USS Street. Low, igniting fuel stores and detonating aircraft below deck. The ship sank within 30 minutes, killing 143 crewmen. Fear swept through the Pacific Fleet. Veteran sailors who had survived years of combat now spoke in hushed tones about the new suicide planes. They seemed unstoppable, fast, direct, and utterly committed. But then came the weapon that had already saved Europe, the proximity fuse. Orders were rushed across the Pacific. Every ship, capable of mounting 5-inch guns, was to be equipped with VT ammunition immediately. Special training began on every deck. Fire early, fire high, and keep firing. The shell will do the rest. The logic was simple. Kamikazes flew straight, no evasive maneuvers, no unpredictable altitude changes. The very nature of their attacks made them ideal targets for proximity-fused shells. At Luzon and Okinawa, the results were astonishing. Radar spotted incoming formations at long range. Gun crews loaded the new ammunition, aimed, and fired. Shells exploded not at random, but precisely where the enemy planes would be mid-air. At the perfect moment, the sky lit up with orange fire bursts. Kamikaze after kamikaze disintegrated before reaching their targets. For the first time, the suicide planes seemed mortal. Still, the Japanese persisted. Between April and June 1945, during the Battle of Okinawa, Japan launched its largest suicide campaign in history, more than 2,000 kamikaze sorties. Waves of aircraft descended like storms upon the Allied fleet. American ships fired until their barrels glowed white. The sea itself seemed to burn. In 3 months of combat, 26 American ships were sunk and 164 damaged. Nearly 5,000 sailors were killed, 5,000 more wounded. Yet without the proximity fuse, those numbers might have been tripled. Analysts later estimated that 2/3 of all VT shells ever produced were fired in those months, and they shot down over 2,000 aircraft that would otherwise have crashed into ships. One gunner aboard the USS Missouri recalled, "We could see them coming, a line of dots over the water. Then the fuses started doing their work. The air just exploded around them. Planes vanished. You could almost feel the weapon thinking. That sense of a weapon that thought haunted many who served. The proximity fuse was a triumph of engineering, yes, but it was also the first real glimpse of automation in war. For centuries, men had aimed, judged, and fired. Now, the shell itself decided when to kill. Even the enemy noticed. Captured Japanese pilots spoke of fear unlike anything they had known. "We could not dodge it," one said. "Even when we were near the ships, the air would burst and tear us apart. It was as if the sky itself was against us." As the kamikaze threat intensified, production of the VT fuse reached levels that bordered on the unbelievable. Across the United States, Over 100 factories worked day and night. Companies that once made radios, cameras, or even toy trains turned their assembly lines toward war. Crosley in Cincinnati, RCA in Indiana, Sylvania in Massachusetts all became part of a vast invisible machine churning out millions of tiny, perfect killers. Workers didn't even know what they were building. They handled sealed components labeled only with code numbers. Security guards watched every gate. Letters were censored, phones monitored. Some employees guessed they were making parts for radar systems. Others thought it might be a new kind of signal transmitter. Only a handful of scientists at Johns Hopkins truly understood what these parts would become. The production numbers were staggering. Early prototypes cost more than $700 each. By 1945, mass manufacturing had cut that cost to under $20. In total, 22 million proximity fuses rolled off assembly lines before the war ended. Each one was a small miracle, a tiny radar brain that could withstand 20,000 Gs of force and still function flawlessly. Behind every fuse was a chain of human hands, women soldering microscopic wires, machinists assembling shock-resistant casings, engineers testing batch after batch under impossible conditions. The failure rate had to remain below 1%. Any deviation meant reinspection of entire lots. In secret testing facilities, shells were fired into concrete bunkers, frozen in Arctic temperatures and baked under tropical heat. Only perfection would be accepted. And somehow, under pressure, fear, and fatigue, they achieved it. By the summer of 1945, the proximity fuse had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of American ingenuity. It had turned defense into offense, chaos into calculation. It had made the skies around Allied fleets almost impenetrable. Without it, many historians later agreed, the invasion of Japan might have been impossible. The kamikaze campaign could have destroyed half the invasion force before it even reached shore. When the war finally ended in August, sailors across the Pacific wrote home about the miracle fuse that had saved their lives. The Navy called it the second greatest secret of the war, behind only the atomic bomb. General Eisenhower, in his memoirs, would later write, "Had the Germans developed it 6 months before us, the invasion of Europe might have failed." In a single invention, science had compressed decades of evolution. The proximity fuse transformed the act of aiming into the act of thinking. It made every shell not just a weapon, but a decision. And it left behind a question that echoed into the post-war world: if machines could now choose when to kill, how long before they chose who to kill? The fuse had done more than win battles. It had opened the door to a future where technology would fight wars almost by itself. When peace finally settled over the smoldering world in 1945, the proximity fuse stood as one of the silent victors of the war, unseen, unheard, but absolutely decisive. It had changed the way men fought, the way nations built weapons, and even the way scientists thought about war itself. In the months that followed Japan's surrender, a vast effort began to dismantle the wartime production machine that had birthed the fuse. The factories that once ran day and night returned to making civilian goods, radios, refrigerators, light bulbs. Crosley returned to home appliances, RCA to entertainment. Yet somewhere deep inside those factories, workers still remembered the sealed crates, the coded labels, the guarded shipments. None of them had known that their hands had helped win the largest war in human history. For the scientists of Section T, the end of war was not an ending at all, it was a beginning. Dr. Merle Tuve, exhausted and gray from 5 years of relentless work, refused awards and medals. He claimed the true credit belonged to every anonymous engineer and technician who made the impossible real. His young physicist, James Van Allen, went on to study cosmic radiation and discovered the belts that still bear his name. The laboratories at Johns Hopkins became the Applied Physics Laboratory, APL, a permanent defense research center. Its foundation, secrecy, and mission were modeled directly after the proximity fuse project. Tuve's philosophy remained simple: Science must not wait for war to justify its worth. He had seen how collaboration between universities, industry, and the military could achieve miracles. The success of the proximity fuse would become the blueprint for American technological supremacy during the Cold War. From missile guidance systems to satellites, from radar to nuclear command and control. But behind the triumph lay a darker reflection. The fuse had not only revolutionized warfare, it had industrialized it. What had once been personal, the aim of a gunner, the timing of a shot, was now automated, optimized, mechanized. Death by calculation. It was the dawn of precision warfare, and the first whisper of the computer age. Military analysts studying the war's aftermath were unanimous. Without the proximity fuse, Allied casualties would have been 30 to 50% higher. The Battle of Okinawa might have ended with half the fleet destroyed. The port of Antwerp might have fallen to V-1 attacks. The invasion of Japan, code-named Operation Downfall, could have cost 1 million lives. And yet, few outside military circles ever heard of the invention. The atomic bomb, with its blinding light and apocalyptic imagery, seized the world's attention. But among generals and scientists, there was quiet consensus. The proximity fuse had been the more practical miracle. It did not end one city in a flash. It changed every battle, everywhere, every day. Post-war intelligence confirmed just how close the Axis powers had come, and how far they had fallen short. German laboratories had worked on no fewer than 50 different proximity fuse prototypes, including electrostatic, magnetic, and acoustic models. None survived Hitler's impatience. In 1940, he had ordered all research stopped unless it could yield results in 6 months. The decision crippled innovation, just as Allied scientists were beginning to succeed. By the time German engineers revisited the idea in 1944, Allied troops were already landing in Normandy. Their test facilities were bombed before the first batch reached production. Japan's attempts had been equally futile. Their vacuum tubes were too large, their materials too brittle. The lack of industrial precision meant that even working designs in theory were useless in practice. One captured Japanese prototype was found to be twice the size of an American fuse and shattered the moment it was fired. The secret had held. The Axis powers never managed to replicate it, even after capturing a few duds late in the war. German scientists reportedly dismissed the devices as Allied propaganda, unable to believe functioning radio components could survive inside an artillery shell. Their skepticism saved countless Allied lives. In the years that followed, proximity fuses evolved quietly. Their descendants appeared in surface-to-air missiles, air-to-air rockets, and anti-missile defenses. Every modern weapon that explodes near a target, from a Patriot missile, intercepting a Scud to a naval phalanx system, defending a carrier carries the DNA of the Mark 32. Fuse fired from the USS Helena in 1943. But the true legacy was not just technological, it was psychological. The proximity fuse had proven that knowledge could shift the balance of war more than numbers or courage ever could. It taught the military a new doctrine. Control the science, and you control the battlefield. The partnership between scholars, engineers, and generals born from Section T became the foundation of a permanent research state, one that would dominate the second half of the 20th century. And for the men who had first used it, the memory never faded. Many of the Helena's crew never fully grasped the magnitude of what they had witnessed. To them, it had simply been another day of survival in a cruel war. But decades later, veterans would recall that morning when a shell exploded mid-air and brought down an aircraft 4 miles away. That instant, they realized, was the hinge of history, the moment when warfare stepped out of the industrial age and into the electronic one. General Eisenhower summarized it best years after the war. "If the Germans had developed and used the proximity fuse 6 months before we did," he wrote, "the invasion of Europe might have been impossible." Was acted 40. That sentence, quietly printed in his memoirs, carried more weight than any headline. Because it wasn't just about a shell, it was about time. About invention arriving just soon enough to tip the scales of fate. For the scientists who had built it, the proximity fuse was a triumph of intellect. For the soldiers and sailors who used it, it was salvation. For history, it was proof that sometimes the smallest creations, a glass tube, a whisper of radio, a spark of current, can decide the destiny of millions. On January 5, 1943, when the USS Helena fired those first fuses into the sky, no one on deck could have imagined how far that sound would echo. It was the sound of war transforming the thunder of metal, electricity, and human genius converging in a single flash. And though peace would return, the principle it unleashed would never rest again. Because once mankind had learned to let machines decide when to kill, the future of warfare, and perhaps of humanity itself, had already begun to change. In the decades after the war, the story of the proximity fuse faded quietly into the background of victory. No parades were held for it, no monuments built. The world remembered the atomic bomb, the weapon of terror and spectacle, but not the invisible innovation that had done just as much to secure the Allied triumph. Yet, among historians, the proximity fuse became known by another name, the unseen revolution. Because it did more than save lives. It transformed how nations thought about technology itself. The collaboration that produced it between universities, private companies, and the military became the blueprint for the modern military-industrial complex. Before 1940, research in America had been academic, scattered, driven by curiosity. After the fuse, it became systematic, funded, and weaponized. The Cold War that followed would not have been possible without this new structure of scientific mobilization. At Johns Hopkins, Section T became permanent. The Applied Physics Laboratory continued working on defense technology, missile guidance systems, radar countermeasures, and later, spaceflight instrumentation. The same engineers who once built the fuse's tiny radar systems designed the control electronics that guided America's first ballistic missiles. Science had found a new home and new masters. It wasn't only America that learned from it. The Soviet Union, analyzing post-war intelligence, concluded that Western victory had been less about manpower and more about electronic dominance. They accelerated their own programs, pouring resources into radar, vacuum tube, miniaturization, and proximity systems for their anti-aircraft defenses. From this race emerged the first generations of guided missiles, weapons that owed their existence to the principles proven inside a 5-inch naval shell. The proximity fuse's core idea, a sensor that decides when to act, became the seed of automation. Every missile that follows its target, every bomb that adjusts its detonation height, every modern drone that reacts without human touch, they all trace their lineage to that fuse. But the story's deeper meaning lies in what it revealed about humanity itself. During the war, when Dr. Merle Tuve was once asked whether he ever hesitated to create a weapon so deadly, he answered quietly, "Our goal was not destruction. It was survival. The alternative was extinction." For him, science was not a choice between peace and war, it was a shield forged under pressure. Yet, as he admitted later, it was also a warning. Once a mind learns to build such power, it will never forget how. The proximity fuse proved something chilling, that intellect could replace instinct, that the precision of machines could exceed the emotion of men. By 1950, the fuse's descendants were already airborne. The first surface-to-air missiles, like the U.S. Navy's Lark and Terrier systems, used the same proximity detonation logic. When the Korean War erupted, proximity-fused artillery again dominated the battlefield. At night, communist attacks against UN positions were shredded by shells that detonated in midair, scattering shrapnel in wide lethal rings. Soldiers who once feared darkness now trusted the technology that had once been too secret to use. By the Vietnam era, the principle had evolved further. Radar-guided fuses became standard in nearly every artillery piece, bomb, and missile. American pilots dropping ordnance over jungle terrain used proximity settings to detonate bombs at treetop level, maximizing shockwaves against hidden enemy positions. The same science that once saved lives over the Pacific now made war more efficient and more deadly. That was the paradox of the proximity fuse. It had begun as a defense, but became an instrument of overwhelming offense. And yet, it continued to inspire awe. At the Smithsonian Institution, one of the original Mark 32 fuses rests behind glass, small, unimposing, barely the size of a coffee cup. Visitors walk past it without realizing they are looking at the ancestor of every smart weapon on Earth. Inside that small cylinder lies a complete radio system: transmitter, receiver, power source, amplifier, and detonator, all engineered to survive the violence of gunfire and still think. Military historians now call it the first artificial intelligence of warfare, a mechanical brain that made a decision without human hands. Perhaps that is why, even decades later, veterans who saw it in action spoke of it with reverence. They remembered the skies over the Pacific, where darkness once meant death until those tiny sparks began to glow above the waves. They remembered the snow of Belgium, when 1,000 shells burst overhead instead of in the ground, turning defeat into victory. They remembered how silence followed after each detonation, the realization that something new had entered the world, something that could not be undone. When General Patton called it a new method of warfare, he was unknowingly naming the future. The 20th century would become defined by that principle, the replacement of man's judgment with the machine's precision. And though the world would move on to faster, smarter, deadlier weapons, the truth remains. The proximity fuse was where it all began. From that day on, the USS Helena, when sailors watched Japanese planes fall from the sky without a single direct hit, humanity took its first irreversible step into the age of automated war. And that step, however small, changed everything. In the decades that followed, few inventions remained so misunderstood, yet so consequential, as the proximity fuse. Its story disappeared beneath the thunder of larger legends: the atom bomb, the jet engine, the birth of the computer. But to those who studied strategy, it became clear. The fuse had not merely changed one war, it had changed the logic of war itself. Before 1943, war had been fought through endurance. Whoever could produce more shells, more men, more steel, would win. The proximity fuse quietly upended that balance. It proved that information could be more powerful than mass. A single shell that knew when to explode was worth 100 that didn't. From that moment forward, warfare began to pivot from strength to intelligence, from muscle to mind. That realization reshaped the military world. In Washington, the post-war Pentagon reorganized its entire research system around the proximity fuse model. A new concept emerged: R&D command. For the first time, scientists had permanent roles in planning, not as outsiders, but as architects. The lessons learned at Johns Hopkins were applied to radar-guided bombs, to nuclear weapon fusing, to early missile defense. The invisible science behind the fuse became the invisible skeleton of the modern military. Meanwhile, its influence reached even further into space. When James Van Allen launched the first radiation-detecting instruments aboard rockets in the late 1940s, he used technology born from the fuse's circuitry. The same rugged, miniaturized tubes that had once survived the shock of naval gunfire now traveled beyond the atmosphere. And when the United States began developing the first satellites, engineers borrowed the proximity fuse's core design principle: autonomous activation, triggered by environmental change. Every spacecraft that powers up automatically in orbit owes something to that invention. Yet, for all its scientific beauty, the fuse's legacy carried a shadow. Because it had taught humanity a dangerous lesson that precision could make killing acceptable. Generals who once hesitated to shell populated areas now ordered strikes with mathematical confidence. It will detonate only when optimal, they said. Accuracy became justification. The boundary between efficiency and morality blurred. By removing uncertainty, the fuse had also removed hesitation. Historians later described it as the most moral and immoral invention of the war. Moral, because it saved Allied lives by reducing wasteful fire. Immoral, because it made the act of killing clinical, invisible, and detached. Still, no one could deny its necessity. The men who fought at Okinawa, who watched kamikazes turn into burning stars above the sea, would never call it anything but salvation. In 1946, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal wrote privately, "The proximity fuse helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without it, our losses would have been beyond endurance." His words echoed those of Eisenhower, who admitted that the fuse's timing coming when it did might have decided the war itself. Had the enemy mastered it first, he wrote, Europe might still be in chains. That was the fragile balance of history. A few months, a few minds, deciding the fate of millions. By the 1,950 seconds, as Cold War tension deepened, the proximity fuse reappeared in new forms. Radar-guided Nike missiles, Bomark interceptors, and Patriot systems all used its descendants' fuses that measured distance, velocity, and trajectory with microsecond precision. The sky that had once been the graveyard of ships became a shield of invisible eyes. And yet, in a sense, every one of those systems was still the Helena's gun, firing again the same principle, only refined and multiplied. The engineers who had built it often spoke of its beauty, a self-contained machine, elegant in its purpose, complete in its logic. It did exactly what it was made to do: detect, decide, destroy. No hesitation, no error, no mercy. To some, it represented humanity's highest form of mastery over matter. To others, it marked the moment humanity surrendered its conscience to circuitry. That duality defined the next half-century. From Korea to Vietnam, from the Persian Gulf to the skies over Ukraine, proximity detonation became the silent partner of every explosion. When radar-guided missiles burst near their targets, when smart bombs sensed altitude before striking, the ghost of the Mark 32 fuse was still there, tiny, tireless, watching, waiting. It had turned warfare from an art into an equation. And perhaps that was the fuse's truest legacy, not the destruction it caused, but the perfection it demanded. Every improvement in modern defense, from infrared sensors to autonomous drones, grew from the same idea that began on the Helena that January morning: that machines could think faster, act sharper, and kill cleaner than men. A fuse no larger than a coffee cup had whispered the future into existence. The men who built it believed they were saving the world. And, in a way, they did. But they also changed it forever, proving that once knowledge becomes weapon, it never sleeps again. The proximity fuse did not end with the war. It became the pulse of the next one. In the years that followed, the proximity fuse vanished quietly into the background of progress. It became just another piece of hardware, buried deep inside new generations of weapons, missiles, rockets, torpedoes, even space interceptors. Few remembered that it had once been a miracle, born in secrecy and desperation. But in military archives, among faded reports and coded memos, its influence is unmistakable. The fuse had done something profound. It had shifted the philosophy of warfare from reaction to prediction. No longer did soldiers wait for the enemy to appear now. Their weapons anticipated them. That single change redefined the tempo of conflict for the next century. At the dawn of the Cold War, when radar domes sprouted across the Arctic and nuclear bombers patrolled the skies, proximity technology formed the nervous system of global defense. Every interceptor missile that waited in underground silos used sensors based on the same principle: detect, measure, detonate. The difference was scale. What once lived inside a 5-inch shell now sat inside weapons powerful enough to erase cities. In Washington and Moscow, scientists who had once studied side by side before the war now raced against one another to perfect the art of automated reaction. Each side believed that speed, not strength, would determine survival. And speed required machines that could decide faster than humans. The fuse had lit that fuse, too. It is strange to think that the future of the world, the nuclear standoff, the missile age, the very concept of mutually assured destruction, all traced its lineage to a device designed not to destroy cities, but to protect a single ship in 1943. The same concept that had defended the USS Helena now governed the balance of global power. Inside defense laboratories, engineers spoke of decision loops. A shell that exploded when near its target had, in essence, made a micro-decision. What if a radar could make a macro one to track, to intercept, to fire without waiting for a human? From that question came the first automated air defense networks, the ancestors of the computer age. The proximity fuse, in its quiet way, had turned the battlefield into a laboratory for artificial intelligence. But while nations built faster machines, a few of the scientists who had created the fuse began to worry about where their logic was leading. Merle Tuve, now a respected elder of American physics, often declined to discuss his wartime work. When pressed, he would only say, "It taught me how fragile control really is. This, another was for my non, and he want to a morgard." He meant that technology, once given purpose, cannot be easily recalled. Every innovation carries forward like a genetic code, recombining in ways its creators never intended. The fuse was proof. A device made to defend ships had become the foundation of an entire philosophy of deterrence. Even the language of war changed. Before the fuse, generals spoke of courage and strategy. After it, they spoke of probabilities, trajectories, and kill ratios. The human vocabulary of conflict had been replaced by mathematics. Yet, amid the machinery, a few reminders of humanity remained. In veterans' reunions decades later, sailors from the Helena would still tell the story of that morning over Guadalcanal, how the sky lit up with bursts that seemed to have minds of their own, and how for the first time they felt protected by something invisible and precise. They didn't talk about science. They talked about relief, about finally being able to fight back against an enemy they couldn't see. In that sense, the proximity fuse had done something paradoxical. It had made war feel safer to those who fought it. And perhaps that was its most lasting danger, that it gave mankind the illusion of control. Because after the fuse, every generation of weapons would promise the same thing: accuracy, efficiency, less collateral damage. And every generation would deliver the same result: war without end, only refined. The Mark 32 proximity fuse was, at its heart, a masterpiece of human ingenuity. But like all masterpieces of war, it carried within it a quiet curse, the realization that intelligence, once given to weapons, never truly returns to the hands that made it. The men who fired it on January 5, 1943, could not have known that they were not just defending their ship, they were defining the future. That morning off Guadalcanal, as the first Japanese bombers fell flaming into the sea, the sailors of the Helena had no idea that the sound echoing across the water was not just victory. It was the beginning of a new age, the age when machines would begin to think, and mankind would have to learn how to live with them. The world moved on, but the idea born aboard the USS Helena never slept. Every time a missile struck its target without touching it, every time a guided bomb exploded at the perfect altitude, a faint echo of that January morning could still be heard. The proximity fuse had not only changed how weapons worked, it had changed how nations thought. In the decades after World War II, that idea, a machine that senses and acts on its own, spread like wildfire. The Korean War saw the first artillery rounds with improved radar proximity fuses, used to stop waves of infantry attacks at night. In Vietnam, bombs with programmable airburst fuses turned entire jungles into open ground. In the Gulf War, missiles using micro-radar sensors struck tanks from above. Each new generation refined the logic of the original fuse. Detect, decide, destroy. The principle was so simple that it became invisible, like oxygen everywhere, unquestioned. When the Patriot missiles of 1991 intercepted Iraqi Scuds, the fuse's descendants made the difference between a successful defense and disaster. The world saw streaks of light on television, but inside those missiles were the same fundamentals Merle Tuve's team had built half a century earlier. The same micro-decision. Now, it was not just weapons that evolved. The very structure of civilization did. The proximity fuse had taught engineers that miniaturization and automation could coexist. Radios shrank into transistors. Computers became portable. The technology of destruction paved the way for the technology of communication. Every smartphone today carries sensors that would have been considered science fiction in 1943. Accelerometers, radar-like detectors, automated triggers, all descended, in concept, from the same chain of thought. But history is not kind to those who forget their origins. As the decades rolled on, the line between invention and conscience blurred even further. Drone warfare reintroduced the moral question Tuve once feared. If a machine can sense when to strike, should it also decide who to strike? Each new algorithm, each new targeting system, carried within it a sliver of the same logic that had guided those first fuses. Knowledge without judgment, precision without empathy. And yet, even with all its consequences, the proximity fuse remains a triumph of the human spirit. It showed that intellect could prevail against chaos, that science, even born of fear, could bend the impossible into form. For the sailors who fired those first rounds, it wasn't a philosophical question. It was survival. They were young men in a war that seemed endless, watching the sky tear open above them. When those shells detonated mid-air, they didn't see history changing, they saw hope. After the war, some of them returned home to quiet lives. They worked in factories, opened shops, raised families. Most never spoke about what they'd witnessed. But when they looked at the night sky, they remembered how it once burned with the light of a new kind of weapon, and how, for a brief moment, mankind had outsmarted death. The proximity fuse didn't just win battles. It bridged the gap between the mechanical and the intelligent, between the soldier and the machine. It was the first whisper of an age that would one day fill the heavens with guided missiles and satellites, drones, and artificial minds, all born from the same question. What if a machine could know when the time is right? That question, once asked, could never be unasked. In the end, history is filled with inventions that changed the world: gunpowder, the steam engine, the computer. But the proximity fuse belongs to a rarer class: inventions that changed how the world changes. It turned knowledge into a weapon and foresight into power. When the war ended, the sailors of the Helena disembarked and faded into peacetime anonymity. Their ship was later sunk by a Japanese torpedo in 1943. But the legacy of its first victory, those few miraculous shells, lived on in every radar-guided weapon that followed. Somewhere in the quiet waters of the South Pacific, beneath the waves, lie the twisted remnants of that cruiser. And somewhere within its rusted hull, perhaps still sealed in a forgotten magazine, rests a single Mark 32 proximity fuse. Its tiny radar silent, its battery long dead. But if you could listen closely, maybe you'd still hear what it once heard: the echo of a target approaching, the heartbeat of invention, the moment when humanity taught steel how to think.